Okay, hi everybody. My name is Munawar Jaffer. I'm also known as by my nickname Jaff, and I've been asked today to talk to you about software methodologies. So in some ways this talk is really categorized as a non-technical discussion, because we're not going to be looking at code, we're not even going to have a command prompt throughout the course of the next 15 or 30 minutes. But we are not even going to talk about systems design. But I would argue that this possibly is an extremely technical discussion, because we're talking about something fairly complicated. When you're talking about code and you're looking at the machine level, things are fairly comprehensible. People understand what's going on. But when we start talking about methodology, and we're not even talking at the code level here, we're not even talking about the design level, but we're starting to talk more and more, as we're going to find out, about methods used at the enterprise level. These things are kind of spongy and fluffy and really hard to get your hands around. So it's really important that everybody starts understanding the terminology and the concepts, and that's really the focus of the discussion today. Now, we've got, as I said, a lot of terminology and a lot of concepts to cover in the 15 minutes that I've kindly been allocated. So 15 minutes, we're going to whiz through this presentation fairly quickly at fairly quick pace. I will ask you, unless it's something fairly important, to hold your questions for the remaining 15 minutes. So let's get cracking. I hope everybody's ready. And I will warn you now that I will be asking questions as we go along and at the end of you. So, you know, keep abreast. Are you all ready? Yes. Great. Okay, let's move on. So this is what we're going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to start off with some terminology just to make sure that we are all on the same page. We're then going to cover methodologies that have been in use and are currently in use. Generally, I'd like to say that they fall into three broad categories, but we'll cover that later. Then we're going to talk a little bit about something called frameworks. We're mainly going to talk about SCRUM and KANBAN. I was asked specifically to make sure we covered tooling. Now, in my opinion, tooling is important, but as we'll get into later on, tooling kind of comes and goes, and really it's the principle. Tooling can be picked up by most of you fairly easily, but it's the principles around methodology and the language and the concepts, I think, that are really sometimes misunderstood. So I want to make sure we get some of that straight. Then if we have time, we'll do a quiz at the end, and then I will open up for questions to me about anything that we've covered. Okay? So, terminology. Okay. This really can be a little bit of a minefield. Methods and methodologies. Does anybody know what a methodology is and what the differences are?
Structured approach.
Yeah, that's good. We're really, when we talk about methodologies today, we're talking about a whole group of methods and rules and ideas, and ones that typically software developers talk about when they talk about methodologies. They kind of fall, as I may have mentioned before, into three broad categories. We often talk about waterfall, we often talk about agile nowadays, and in between there was a fair bit of spiral. But even sometimes we talk about extreme programming. Now, methodologies kind of fall into fashion and out of favor at various times. So we are going to cover, just to help us understand the differences and help us understand why we have come this way, and help us keep track of what the road ahead looks like. We are going to cover a little bit of history of how some of these methodologies have come into and out of fashion, just so we can understand what real best practice currently is. Okay? Next, really, in terms of the methodology, in terms of terminology, is processes. Now, processes, often I always think of as just phases. You know, essentially, when we talk about software, we're talking about Sometimes we're talking about requirements analysis to figure out what it is that needs to be built. Sometimes we're talking about design. Often the core of it is a coding phase, and of course there's a testing phase. So these are the things that are part of the methodology. Now, different methodologies will call them different things, but essentially I always feel they tend to be one of four: design, implementation, test, and maintenance. The last thing in terms of terminology is software development frameworks. Now, this word frameworks, I personally find, is often misunderstood. As software developers, we're always talking about frameworks, but we talk about things like that we come across, like Angular or React or .NET or struts, and these are software abstractions in a way. These are about software libraries that we use day to day as software developers. But here we're talking about development frameworks like SCRUM and KANBAN. These are things that help give direction or a way of using a methodology. As we're going to be talking about, initially software methodologies were quite prescriptive. They went into a lot of detail about exactly how things should be done. Increasingly modern methodologies, we find, are becoming more lightweight. So that's great. They're not difficult to understand, they're not difficult to use, but sometimes they need a little bit more, a little bit of extra, and that's where software development frameworks like Scrum and Kanban come in. They give us a little bit more direction about exactly how we should do things when we undertake these methodologies. Okay, we'll now go on to slide number 4. As I mentioned, the methodologies have been changing. Currently, really, Agile is a preferred approach in many projects. It's valuable, though, as I said, to understand some of the history. When we first started, software development methodologies first started emerging in the 60s. Systems development life cycle was really the way in which these things emerged. And that was a waterfall, sort of four-phased approach. However, when people started using SDLC and later on SDM, which it became, which was also waterfall, people found that delivered systems, although they were kind of what was prescribed, what was written down as the required for the system, they've really failed to meet what the users really wanted. And quite often it was rooted in how long the whole process took. It took ages for people to actually deliver software. And by the time they did it, the users had moved on. Their requirements were no longer what they were. It was quite commonplace, and in some ways still is, for example, in government software projects, for it to take many, many years to deliver software. And life's moved on by then. So that's really one of the reasons why these heavyweight processes are no longer in fashion. We now want something a little bit lighter. In the 1990s, something fairly dramatic changed in the way in which we developed software. Up until then, really, it was all about procedural programming, and data was kind of kept separate from the programming. But in the 90s, OOP, object-oriented programming, became the new paradigm, where data and the methods to access those data were really put together in the form of an object, and that encapsulation really changed and really initiated a lot of change in which, in the ways in which we went about developing software. Let's look a little bit more now into waterfall and that heavyweight approach. On the slide in front of you now, you see the typical waterfall model. People would start out and really this was borrowed in many ways from things like construction of buildings and bridges. The engineering best practice borrowed from civil engineering, if you like, where everything had sort of an approach, a gradual approach, you know, to exactly what needed to be built. And anytime progress was made, or anytime a change happened, for example, if you went through a requirements analysis, then started doing the design, if you had to make changes and really think about, make changes, instead of carrying on delivering the end software, you would actually go back and feedback loop into the requirements analysis process. This whole waterfall mechanism really was, the reason for it was to introduce rigor into the way in which software was built, because it was in those times software was becoming larger and larger, and it was becoming difficult to manage. And as you know, software is not as easy to visualize or for people to understand as making buildings or bridges. The whole approach really was about getting things defect-free, and a lot of it was about documentation. You know, if you built a system, let's say we've been talking a lot about Netflix and the interface and the functionality of Netflix and those types of systems. The requirements for those sorts of systems would be immense, you know, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pages. Now, the reality is, although it seemed good in principle, it gave people confidence before spending millions on software that they had all this detail. The reality is nobody ever looked at that huge amount of documentation. So things really were primed for change. And that's where the next stage, if you look, is Spiral came along. The approach of Spiral software development methodology is about, you know, starting small, starting with prototyping, and then quickly delivering software, and then iterating on that. And really, this formed the root of what we have today, which is Agile. Just briefly, you know, as I said, that Spiral then went into Agile, and now we have Scrum and Agile frameworks. Let's move on and have a look a bit more detail at Agile itself. So, what is Agile? You can see there on the diagram some similarity with what the iterative process that I described in the Spiral technique. We would literally iterate round planning, design, build and test, and then review. Code was really divided up into those sprints, and that's really the core of the agile process. Now, it does depend a little bit on exactly how. It's a very lightweight process, so it does really depend on which framework you use. And we're going to be looking at the two most popular frameworks in software, which are SCRUM and KANBAN. Just before we leave methodologies and that historical view, you know, in the early noughties, the RUP, which was the Rational Unified Process, adopted Agile as well, and that was kind of really it was an indicator really for industry observers to realize that Agile was really the way to go. Everybody pretty much adopted and favored the Agile process. And now more recently, in the current decade, Agile has become so popular that more and more I'm hearing about it being adopted right throughout enterprise levels. So it's not only a software development methodology now. We've got businesses talking about adopting an Agile approach to the entire enterprise. And now we're seeing the emergence of some frameworks that help adopt Agile methodologies right throughout organizations, not just through the software development parts of organizational operation. So I'd like to speak about the Agile Manifesto. I've said a couple of times that, you know, Agile is lightweight when we compare it to waterfall and other approaches. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, when Agile really started to take hold, you know, a large number, I can't remember, it was 20 or 30 really software gods got together. They really sat and talked and discussed for quite a long time about what the best approaches for developing software were. And they came up with really, really simple, and I've listed them there, 4 main guidelines, really, just to give a feel. It's really about an ethos, if you like, about how to develop software. It was all their combined learning and experience put together in a very lightweight way, and this was the software manifesto. The Agile Software Manifesto. It really valued people working together and their interactions more than the tooling and the process. It tended to be quite heavy without delivering value. It valued working software rather than documentation that helped you figure out, you know, how to fix software. It valued, you know, closely liaison with customers and dealing with change, you know, responding to change quickly rather than trying to get it right first time, just getting better at actually improving. That's the Agile Manifesto for us. So let's have a look now at last at the Scrum framework. As I said, Agile is more of an ethos, but we need a little bit more structure typically to help us use it. And that's where Scrum comes in. On the slide there, you see 3 main groups of people or categories of people. One is the product owner. Now, this is the person, the boy or the man or woman who really is there in the team to help represent the stakeholders. By stakeholders, we're talking about, you know, the users of the system or the management, the executives that have an interest in the system being developed. Of course, you have the software development team. And really, one of the things that Scrum tells and tries to enforce is that team be multidisciplined. So ideally, for example, you know, you may have front-end people, back-end people. You might have people that are really focused on deployment of the developed system. So the idea is that team, regardless of the actual detailed function that they perform, it is one team. You try to have them as multidisciplined teams. And then you've got this one person that's the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is the person that really facilitates and looks after that team. The idea is that he or she facilitates and protects that team, allows them to work efficiently, effectively. And just to come back to the product owner, I may have failed to mention, he really is the face-off. So the product owner is effectively the customer. The team obviously is the main focus in the development of the development, and the Scrum Master has got a role to make sure that all the processes of Scrum are followed, and to protect the team. Even though the Scrum Master is protecting the team, allowing them to work, it's not somebody that typically has people management responsibilities. So that's an important factor, I feel. You see there on the slide there's a product backlog. So you may have started working yourselves on a product backlog on some of the projects that we have. These are essentially a list of user stories. So, you know, a user wants to do X because of Y. These are the types of very simple descriptions that these stories have, and these are all kept in a backlog or on a board. And then we go through a process of prioritizing them. Typically, what we start out with Scrum is deciding how long we want a sprint to do. A sprint is a time box, if you like, of, you know, when we're going to deliver software. So in our own project here, typically we have 4 weeks, and I know in my own team we've adopted a 1 week sprint timeline. So every Friday we're trying to make sure we deliver our sprint. Every Monday we're doing a prioritization session where we're trying to decide what it is going to go into that week's release. So that's the sprint, and that's the sprint planning meeting. What we decide goes into that sprint, goes into the sprint backlog, and then there are ceremonies associated with Scrum, interestingly. There are 4, I think, here. One is the daily stand-up, which I think all of you are somewhat familiar with. There's a sprint review that happens at the end of the sprint, so typically on a Friday or a Thursday when something has been delivered. And then there's also a retrospective, again, just to look back on what was good, what was not, and try and improve processes that are going on. Okay, so that is Scrum. Kanban shares a lot of things with Scrum, but interestingly there's just a bit of difference. The time boxing element is not there if the Kanban framework is adopted. Instead, there's more of a focus on the queue. So it's all really about the queue prioritization. Some of Kanban, I believe, is actually rooted in manufacturing systems. So there, we're talking about, deciding what is important and making sure that is delivered to the customer, making sure not too many activities are taken on in parallel, but the time boxing element is not there, but instead it's about prioritizing the workload. Okay, and here on the next slide we're just reiterating that there are a few differences between Kanban and Scrum. Notice that in Kanban there are no roles specified. Notice that the iterative approach, as I said, is there in both, but in Scrum it's time boxed. There is less emphasis on estimating. In Kanban it's really about getting the most important stories delivered to some degree without worrying about how long and how much effort they're going to take. And another difference is that Scrum really does encourage cross-functional teams. Okay, before we get on to the quiz, Trello and Jira are 2 tools that are fairly commonly in use for people doing Agile. Both are actually developed and run by Atlassian, who have a great reputation. They're a little bit different. Jira tends to be more configurable and really about software. Trello tends to be really about any project. So, in fact, I'm considering implementing Trello for one of my friends who's having some struggles within his business to manage staff and projects. It's completely not a technical business at all. It's actually an accountancy business. I'm going to try and persuade him to adopt Trello in that. So it can be used for pretty much anything. It does. Both of them, of course, support Agile. The only other thing I guess worth mentioning is that Trello tends to come out of the box with Kanban boards. In Jira, it's much more configurable. You could even potentially, if you really wanted to, configure Jira to support a waterfall approach if you wanted. Okay, so there's two tools that you're likely to come across. How am I doing for time? Sorry, I didn't...
No. So 8 minutes.
Oh, okay. So, pop quiz, if I may. Can anybody give me some methodologies? I'd like at least 3. Agile, waterfall, and? Spiral, good. Scrum, no, wrong answer. Who said that? I won't shame you. No, so we'll get on to Scrum in a minute, I guess. And how about processes? Can somebody give me a few processes in software development? Okay, so I'm looking really for coding, testing, design, those sorts of things. Okay. How about frameworks? Can I have 2 framework examples?
Kanban.
Kanban, yeah. Scrum, great, thank you. Okay, now on Scrum in particular, can somebody give me the 3 roles that we spoke about?
Owner,
Product owner, great. Team, great.
And
Scrum Master, well done. Everybody's been listening, that's great. And can you tell me what that ranked list that we talked about of user stories is called? Backlog, great. And how about those iterations that we spoke about in Scrum? Sprints, thank you. And what about the 4 types of ceremonies that you have in Scrum? Stand-ups? Retrospective? Sprint planning?
and finish. Done. Or in progress.
Sprint review? Great, thank you. I believe they're considered a little bit different, but I could be wrong. Okay, cool. Thank you. Everybody's been listening, which is great. So there was an awful lot more I wanted to talk about, but I thought I would just give you a list of other reading. So that's the last slide here in the presentation. One thing that's not on there is prints that I think would be useful if somebody wants to understand. Again, it's just about understanding some of the terminology. When you go and talk to software people, or when you go to interviews potentially, you know, methodologies quite often come back up, and it can be easy to get confused or to give the wrong response. But really, it's not rocket science, but it's worth spending a few minutes reviewing some of the terminology. I think that really helps. So, any questions? Thank you. Well, any questions for me?
Kanban is also called just-in-time in manufacturing.
Ah, okay, yeah. A lot of the techniques, quite a few of them come from Japanese manufacturing companies. They've been adopted more recently in software. Yeah. Yeah. So I've put on there on that last slide, Kaizen, which I think comes again from manufacturing. Lean, which also comes from manufacturing. Typically, Toyota, I think, did a lot of work on there. And I've put on there Scrum Ban, which is a new phrase to me, I must say, because you can see that we in this arena at Kadiri, we've been adopting really Scrum with the Kanban board that you look at every day, and we also use it, some of us, with Trello. So that tends to be called Scrum Ban, apparently. It's a very common, I've come across it many times being used, so it's very common to combine the 2 frameworks in that way. Any other questions?
Me?
Yes.
Can I have the microphone, please?
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was great. There's a couple of, thoughts on my side. So, first of all, I found very interesting that some of this terminology, it comes from Japan. But Japan, similarly to other industrial countries like Germany, they struggle with 20 quotes, struggle with modern software development. Why so modern countries like Japan or Germany struggle with modern development techniques? Because these countries, these industrial countries, they are used to spend a lot of time thinking, planning, delivering, right? So the journey is very long, right? It's like a chain. Do something like building a car, then do something, then do something. However, modern coding is about not planning that much. It's about reacting quickly, right? And this is where they don't feel that comfortable, historically speaking, right? That's one thing.
I would add that it's arguable that software development is not so, we don't tend to call it engineering anymore, because as we become better at it, we find actually it's less like engineering, it's more of an art form. It really is. I've often heard the comparison with of software development and software developers as the old stonemasons. There is an aspect of artistry to it.
Cool. Thank you. The other thing is between Scrum and Kanban, based on my perspective. So when I started using AGILE in Germany in 2009, Scrum was actually the king in Europe at that time, right? So short sprints, then you release, then you plan. But something I noticed over time is that Kanban is becoming way more popular than Scrum. Why? Because Kanban is about maximizing the time the developer is coding. With Kanban, you don't have any meeting. You don't have any review, right? You don't have any plan. You get rid of the majority of, you keep it retro, stuff like that, but you get rid of the majority of the events. So with Kanban, 90+% of the time you are coding, that's what you get paid for, right? So this is Kanban actually. You got one task, you work on it, and then you deliver to code to Heroku, and that's it, right? And that's live. It's live, right? You don't need to review anything. You don't need to prepare a backlog of 10 tasks. Yeah, that's it. You take one task and you deliver it, right? Big companies, they are switching to Kanban, and based on my experience, companies like HSBC, they do thousands of releases every year. Every year, they have one task, they deliver. They can do 50 releases in one day. So they don't have the concept of the package, of the backlog of tasks, right? One task, deliver, one task, deliver. Right?
Yeah, I think what becomes very important in that model is quality control at every stage of the process. Now, like conventionally, what used to happen is until like microservices, containers, etc., serverless came into the fore now, people used to bundle up all the features and deliver one release, and which used to go in every 6 months, so 1 year into production basically. So people had all sorts of time to do unit testing, integration testing, regression, etc. But now, if we are doing this in a lean fashion, you need to be 100% sure, so your tests are all, watertight, that kind of thing, or you're able to roll back quickly. It again boils down to the impact of the change, because if it's something like a banking system where a change affects the transactions and it's very difficult, then you need to be much more careful. But if it's something like a social network where eventual consistency, we don't so much care about data, that kind of thing. It all depends on the use cases, I guess.
Could you do something, Jeff? Could you show the slide number 13?
Remind me which one it is.
That one, yeah. No, the next one. The camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you give me the microphone, sorry? Yes, thank you. Yes, about what Bala is mentioning, you can see on the right-hand side the gray circle, SIT and UAT, right? So these two environments are vital in the Kanban world. So generally speaking, today with conflicts, once you've done with a task, you deploy it to Heroku, and then everyone can access the feature, right? But that's not how the industry works. Before pushing stuff to your customers, there is a process of, well, they can review it, right? Someone can review it, right? So once you deploy, the first thing you do is you deploy it to SIT. SIT stands for System Integration Testing. That's an environment in the cloud. Could be private cloud, could be public cloud, could be Heroku, anywhere, right? But which is not public. But yes, a bunch of developers have access. So in SIT is where you test that what you've been working in conflicts, it works fine, it connects to the database, it's not local, it's not your machine anymore, it's the cloud, right? So you check that different components play well together. Once you get the green tick on SIT, you deploy to UAT, user acceptance testing. So generally UAT, this is for business. Why you are working on task number 13, for example? Because someone in business wanted to build task number 13, right? So once you deploy to UAT, you send the task back to business, hey, you want the 13? Here is 13, please have a look. So these guys, they don't have any technical understanding about how it works. They got access to a URL, and they can click around, and they can see if task number 13, if the synopsis, it looks as expected or not, right? So once we got like the green flag from business and UAT, then it's when we do the deploy, it's when the functionality goes live.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, and I would also add that it's don't unless, although this is UAT and SIT is mentioned on the Kanban framework, really those deployment to those environments is common practice in pretty much any methodology and any approach you use nowadays. Okay, thank you everybody.